a strange world that we live in, and the future isn't what it used to be. We've always had such an infinite capacity for creation and compassion and joy, but also for rage and cruelty. You see, I think your life and everything is a non-linear system. We understand linear systems, cause and effect, positive correlation and negative correlation. The problem with a non-linear system is that the interactions quickly become too complex. No one remains one person. And what if a conversation could change the way that you think about yourself and the world? And what if everything that you held to be true was somehow, in some way, wrong? I'm Dr. Mark Halloran, and you're listening to Deep Trouble on 94.9 Main FM. Professor Mehmet Ozalp is an Islamic theologian and public intellectual. He's established the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University in 2011. He's the founding director of Islamic Sciences and the Research Academy of Australia. He started this in 2009. He received his PhD from the University of Sydney, and he is the author of 3 books, including Islam Between Modernity and Tradition. Mehmet, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be here.
That's okay. I think I should first acknowledge that this is not our first conversation. We've spoke before on the podcast, but I thought that it was important to outline that we'll be covering a lot of some of the issues that we've covered before, a lot of the issues that we've covered before. And the approach that I take, I hope, is not to be salacious or invidious, but to try and look at some of the more difficult subject matter so that we can open it up and openly discuss it.
I look forward to it. Yes.
Sure. So I thought I'd begin by talking about, I'd recently read Geoffrey Blainey's A Brief History of the World, and there's a chapter on Islam, and he talks about Islam being an enigma and a mystery to the West. And he comments in it that he finds it curious that a religion that has often been singled out for its subjection of women was in some ways started or found its start with a woman, which was Muhammad's first wife, who was a widow, and who really helped his first follower, helped with the birth of Islam. I was wondering if you'd tell me about Khadija.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you'd tell me about her and his other wives and his daughters. He has 4 daughters, and the significance of them in relation to the birth of Islam.
Sure. Well, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as Muslims say that at the end of his name, he was an ordinary person in Mecca in the 7th century, early 7th century. He was born 571 and led a life of trade. Mecca is not a very good, it's not an agricultural town. The only way to survive is through trade. And he got involved in that with his wife. He was actually employee of his wife. He did a trade caravan when he was 25, and Khadija was so impressed that she proposed indirectly marriage to Muhammad, and he happily agreed. And she was his senior, as reports say, 15 years older than Muhammad himself. And nevertheless, they had a very loving marriage. They deeply loved each other. Prophet Muhammad, even later when she died, he always remembered her and said that she was his greatest supporter. And especially in that instance of receiving the first revelation, before that, the Prophet, as Muhammad, as the person, he would seek seclusion on a mountaintop, Mount Hira, and spend a whole month reflecting and worshipping God in a way that he understood best. He was a monotheist, even though he didn't follow any religion. He didn't believe in the polytheism of Mecca. He believed in that the God, and he wanted to have a relationship. And then he has an experience in a cave on mountaintop, where an angelic being appears and says to asks him to read, and he says, I don't know how to read. And then he squeezes him, and this happens 3 times, and eventually the first revelation is given. And naturally, that's you don't expect that on a mountaintop when you're all alone, and the Prophet just rushes away and goes straight home and says to his wife, cover me, cover me. And eventually he's out of that traumatic state, and then talks to his wife, and she consoles him and supports him. And he's actually thinking, am I going mad? Am I being possessed? And she says, no, you're not. You're a very good man. You help the poor, you help your relatives. God will not forsake you. And then she actually takes him to her cousin, Waraka, who's actually one of the few Christians in Mecca. He was an elderly man. And Waraka says, this is the same thing that happened to prophets in the Bible. You are a prophet. And that's not the only vindication. Later he gets revelation and visitation from Archangel Gabriel, according to Muslim tradition. So that early support was extremely important for Khadija. And later also in Mecca, when persecution started, obviously you need a very strong wife next to you to support you at home, rather than not like, as they say, the wife of Noah was not very helpful to him, and then she's always juxtaposed to that, and one of her daughters, Fatima, became a very important person even after Prophet Muhammad's death, and his lineage actually continues through Fatima. She has 2 sons from Ali, who was also a cousin of the Prophet, and the first child Muslim at the time, and the 4th Caliph, 4th successor after Prophet Muhammad. So it was a very important marriage, and she's an extremely important person in the early history of Islam.
I suppose a lot of the charges that you hear against Muhammad, well, there's a conversation that's generally had which talks about Muhammad either as just being a prophet of peace, and that's all, or a military leader or a warlord. And that seems to be a massive oversimplification. How would you define it? How would you define the relationship between Muhammad as the prophet and the man of peace, and the man who talks about equity and helping the poor and helping the orphans, and the man who has to lead military campaigns?
Yeah, there's a new book came out by Juan it's called Prophet of Peace. He really examines the world around the time when Prophet Muhammad was alive. It was a hostile world, and you had to navigate yourself through that. And you see, certainly Prophet Muhammad took part in wars, but they happened later towards the end of his life and mission, when he has so many followers that they establish a community and a society in Medina. The fact that the Prophet had to leave Mecca with all his followers, even though they could have had a violent resistance in the city. People actually come to him, his followers, said, why don't we fight? He says, no, we can't. And then they leave, they immigrate to another city. And importantly, people in Medina invite him as a peacemaker, because they were having tribal wars. They saw in him and within Islam a potential to have, peace and order. And the Prophet, I think that's an evidence that tells us about the Prophet's nature himself. Like, either a warlord is you have to be violent, and you have to have that demeanor to be a warlord. Whereas the Prophet is the opposite. He was a very tranquil demeanor. All his descriptions are in that way. And but the Quran in that early period challenges non-believers to bring about arguments, counter-arguments to what Quran is talking about. But the fact that the polytheist leaders at the time chose violence and suppression rather than a peaceful dialogue or intellectual debate shows the power of Islam, in my opinion. But one of the most important, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Prophet had a moderate and peaceful nature. I'll just mention two very quickly. The first one is he signed a treaty with the Meccans in 627 after Meccans tried to invade Medina and actually slaughter Muslims. They were not successful. And so the Prophet, with 1,500 of his followers without weapons, actually goes to Mecca to have pilgrimage, and they don't let him in. And then he signs a treaty with the Meccans at the time, a 10-year non-aggression treaty. And the terms of the treaty was against Muslims. And even some of his followers, prominent followers, objected, why are we signing this treaty? We don't have to.
Yes.
But yet the Prophet signs it, and there's a chapter in the Quran, chapter 59, it calls it victory. So signing a treaty is called victory. I think that's really important to as an evidence to show the Prophet preferred peace. And he also signed peace treaties with all neighboring tribes around him, and he never broke his treaties. This is very important as well. And finally, when eventually Mecca, the Muslims and the Prophet became powerful, and eventually Mecca broke the treaty, and when Muslims marched towards Mecca, the Prophet used diplomacy so that they wouldn't fight, and the city was handed over to Muslims, without a fight. That's very important. And on top of that, he asks everybody, what do you think I'm going to do with you? The Meccans, his enemies, who persecuted him, his followers for 20 years. They say, well, you're a noble person, we only expect nobility from you. And he says, I say to you what Joseph said to his brothers, you can go home with peace. He basically declares general amnesty. Now, these things are, to us, look very normal, but in 7th century, in a hostile world, these were amazingly progressive in terms of peacemaking. I think people approach Prophet Muhammad very simplistically, and just because he took part in warfare, certain wars, they declare him warlord. If you really add up all the time he spent in battle, it's 1.5 days. 1.5 days out of 23-year mission. And in all the conflicts, on both sides, there were about 300 people died. And these, any life is valuable,
yes.
But nevertheless, I'm sure without Islam being there, a lot more people would have died in tribal warfare at the time. So the Prophet was living in a hostile world. He was leading his people. You don't expect a leader to be scared, not to show courage when they're attacked, when they have to defend themselves. You expect leader, whether they're spiritual prophets or any leader, to be upfront and lead their people with courage. And we always recognize that kind of leadership as heroic.
Yes.
And when people die in those circumstances, we say that they paid the ultimate price and sacrificed their lives so that their people could live in peace. I guess, it depends on which side you're on. Sometimes in these kind of things, people pick sides. And I think that's what's happening with Prophet Muhammad, that if you're a non-Muslim and Westerner, there's a supposition that Islam is the enemy.
Yes.
Muslims are the alien, foreign, and therefore all battles that Prophet took place was against us. Kind of, there's a projection made in the mind, and then Prophet and Muslims are seen as the enemy, and therefore anyone who fights you, they're considered evil people. Yeah.
Well, we talk about that in relation to, I suppose, ISIS's own conceptions as well, in terms of their battles against Christian crusaders, that whole narrative. I do think that is the issue in terms of the complexity of history and the narrative around a person. So on one side, I think you have people that simply almost ablate any idea that Muhammad would be a military leader. A general can still be a good general, essentially, and go into battle, can't they? They can be somebody who really wants to bring about peace, but they realise that war may be essentially be an inevitability. And it seemed to me from reading the Quran, and that's obviously I'm a naive reader, but one of the surahs talks about you're not the aggressor. So you only fight to defend yourself. You have a responsibility to defend yourself and your people, but you're not the person who's the aggressor. And I think that's a very good principle. I do think that you can't underplay the violence of the time as well. I mean, the Muslims put the Jews of Khaybar to the sword. These battles, the Meccan battle would have been, has been said mostly bloodless, because once they broke the treaty, the Muslims were in such strength. I suppose if you were being a skeptic about it, you would say that perhaps Muhammad only signed those treaties when he was in a position of lack, but then it changed when he was in a position of strength. And I wonder how you respond to that.
But when he was powerful, he never broke the treaties. Like, I mean, if that really refutes that argument.
Yes.
But I just want to say that, firstly, maybe the fact that the Prophet Muhammad took part in battles, in my opinion, is not a disadvantage to Islam. I actually wrote a whole article on this.
Yes.
That it is an advantage because of the fact that he took part in battles, and because the Quran talks about, military engagement, and more importantly, Quran talks about legal and ethical principles involved in how should you meet. What should be the response? What should you do with the prisoners of war? We get all of that through Quran and Prophet's examples. So what that enabled Muslims to do was to build a legal theory and laws to do with warfare. I think that's important because it's better to have laws than nothing at all, right? Because, it's 7th century or thereafter, even until modern times, in battlefield, people just did anything they could. They wiped out populations. They carpet bombed cities, and we had that 20th century
battlefield ethics.
Or when they captured a city like Mongols, they slaughtered the entire population. Whereas Muslims never did that, because there were ethical and legal guidelines and principles, laws that Saladin could not slaughter the Christians of Jerusalem when he captured it, because it was against Islamic law. I think this is very important. And secondly, about the Jews of Medina, there were firstly the fact that the Prophet was in a powerful position. He was the leader in the city from get-go in 622. Like he's a prophet, but he's invited to Medina as a leader, and he what he does is he immediately signs negotiates a document, 52 articles. It kind of becomes like a constitution. How should you treat each other? What should be the tribal relationships between entered tribes and also between Muslims and Jews and so on? They're all laid out in that agreement, and Jewish tribes, they signed the treaty. And one of those conditions was that if outside force attacked the city, they would equally defend. Actually, in that document, for the first time, an idea of nation is defined. It's called ummah. Ummah.
Is this part of the constitution of Medina?
It's in there, and basically Jews are included as part of ummah. Today, ummah means kind of like the Muslim, worldwide Muslim nation. It excludes everyone else. Right. But in that time, in Medina, it included Jews, very interestingly. So basically that also puts the idea of a citizen of that city. So you had to defend if an outside force attacked, equally. And this is where there were other issues there were 3 tribes, 2 of them, one of them tried to assassinate the Prophet. The other one, there was attack to Muslims, and there was a fight that escalated. And the third one, Beni Qurayza, the one that you refer to, they actually, when Medina was sieged, they collaborated with the invaders.
Right.
I mean,
So this was
they made
treason, essentially.
Exactly, and it was very precarious for them too, because if the invaders or the polytheists won, they could be killed.
Right.
And if they don't win, they're making a treason. So that was a hard decision on their part.
Yes.
And both sides were trying diplomacy, Muslims were trying to keep them on their side. I guess the other guys were trying to convince them to support.
Yes.
They eventually coalesced. They thought the invaders were too strong, and they actually supported them. That is an act of treason. And treason is punishable by death. In terms of, but the Prophet, what he offers them is, even in that case, the Prophet still follows the treaty, the Medina Constitution, which was actually if Jews did anything wrong, they would be trialed according to Jewish law. And in Jewish law, treason is punishable by death.
Right.
And they chose that, the people. Now, in terms of the numbers, I think
by their own law.
Sorry?
By their own law.
By their own law. Yeah, they wanted to be, because the Prophet offered, do you want to be trialed according to your laws or Islamic law? They said our laws.
Would there have been a difference in the outcome?
I think there would be. The Prophet's nature is very forgiving. We see a lot of instances of forgiveness, generosity, as in the case of all of the persecutors and people in Medina who murdered his relatives and in a terrible way, and then he still forgave them. The person who killed his uncle Hamza, who was one of his greatest supporters, the Prophet sent him letters inviting him to Mecca and that he would be forgiven, and he eventually comes.
Yes.
And he was a slave, not even an important person.
Yes.
Now, the numbers of the Beni Qurayza Jews that have been punished after that incident is exaggerated and debatable. This month we published an article in the journal that I edit, Australian Journal of Islamic Studies, where the number is challenged.
Right.
Because some sources say 600, some sources say 900 males were executed. That's horrendously very large number. Firstly, we don't even know there were that many people in that tribe. But the sources say that the people were put in a house. How do you put 900 people in a house? So it's most likely that the leaders of the tribe were held responsible and they were punished, whereas the rest were released. And by the way, just to tell you, when the Prophet passed away,
yes,
he pawned his shield with a Jewish person. He borrowed money from a Jewish citizen of Medina. This shows that there were still Jews in the city.
Yes.
And that the Prophet had good relations with them, and he was borrowing money, and that's, I think, telling.
You talk about that this was the constitution in Medina was the first constitution, fully fledged constitution that had been developed. And
which defined a pluralistic and multi-faith society.
And it sounded as though it had lots of parts of it were about equity, and there was almost like an early socialist element to it.
The kind of pluralism that Prophet Muhammad has applied in Medina, and also, by the way, that was developed later on in Muslim societies. And it came to eventually, in Ottoman Empire, it was legislated as a policy of, it was called Millet system. Millet means nation, where every religious community were recognized as an independent community in its own right, and they were given religious freedom, educational freedom, and so on. But I have to say that after those incidents with the Jewish tribes, there was a bit of a regression with the dhimmi policy, because dhimmi policy is more, it's a little bit different to the Constitution of Medina. Constitution of Medina was purely pluralistic, and I think it's a better model for our modern world.
Right.
Whereas, obviously, when that experiment did not go too well, there were another Christian community down south near Yemen. They wanted to engage a relationship with the Prophet, and what's called the dhimmi agreements were signed. Dhimmi agreement basically says that non-Muslims could live under Muslim rule freely. They could have economic, activities, religious freedom, and they did not have to fight in the battles. So they were not conscripted, and in return for that, they had to pay a dhimmi tax.
Right.
And Muslims paid the zakat tax, by the way. Sometimes people say, non-Muslims were paying money, Muslims were not paying anything. No, they were also
The
zakat.
The zakat, it's a form of charity, we should explain. And
It's a compulsory charity or alms. There's another word for charity in Islam, sadaqah,
right.
which is in Judaism. It's in Hebrew, it's zadaqah. It's very similar.
Yeah.
They're related languages.
It's sometimes I've read that the zakat is equal to 15 times what the global world aid provision is. I'm not sure if that's correct.
If zakat is paid now in the world, it would wipe out poverty immediately. And Thomas Piketty, in his book Capitalism, or Review of Capitalism, he talks about a need for a tax that is based on assets rather than income, because that's the only way to close the gap between rich and poor, which that's what zakat is about. It is kind of religious alms. At the end of the day, it's individuals paid. In our time, it's voluntary, or people paid on their own accord.
Yes.
The governments don't collect it, but at the time of the Prophet and thereafter, a few centuries, it was collected by the state, right. And also, but they could only distribute it to certain categories of people, like poor, needy.
Yes.
And it couldn't be spent on anything else. So even they say, like by 715, through zakat, poverty was wiped out in the Muslim world,
right? And
that there were excess funds, and they were given to Christians. Because that's actually one of the categories that you can give to others, people of other religions as well.
Well, I was interested in talking about those caliphates, but also Medina and the establishment of sort of religious societies that are pluralistic, Jews and Christians and there's a sect called Sabians and Muslims all living together. But then I was also interested in the differences as well, that Islam comes Prophet Muhammad comes as a seal of prophets. And so I was wondering what the criticisms were from Islamic scholars or from the Quran about the books, like the Gospel in Christianity and the Torah and the Book of Prophets within Judaism.
Well, Quran mentions that Torah was revealed to Moses, so Muslims have to accept that Torah as revealed to Moses as a revelation from God.
But there's also where it's talked about and discussed that these books are distorted. So is the Torah and the Book of Prophets distorted?
There could be. The Quran's view is that that God does not reveal any new revelation unless it's equal or better than what was revealed. Yes, there is the belief that some of the message was lost or distorted, whether by accident or by sectarian interpretations.
Yes.
And that risk is always there for everyone. So it's essential to maintain the original text. And in history, it was not very easy to preserve written text. So there is, I guess, there is the confidence that Muslims have in the Quran as a preserved revelation is far greater than the confidence that Muslims have in the Gospels and the Torah being preserved as it was revealed. This doesn't mean that entire text is dismissed. You know, Muslim scholars look at it from the perspective of does it contradict the Quran or not?
Yes.
You know, if you just believe that Quran is word of God, latest revelation, and obviously it's going to update itself, and if there was anything disputed, it's going to clarify. So that's how Muslims look at it. So the Quran becomes kind of like the criteria to know whether anything in the Torah and the Gospels are true or not.
It's discussed in terms of shirk. So certain beliefs or beliefs gleaned from things in the Gospel, and we'll talk about the Gospels in terms of those things. So I think they're quite specific. But I was interested in Judaism and if there were distortions within the Torah, whether there were specific ideas around what those distortions may be, or whether there was just a general idea that there may be distortions.
It's a general idea. Unfortunately, Muslim scholars, there's no comparative theology, or it's not as developed as it's in perhaps Judaism and Christianity. And we need that in our time. We just had in our centre in Sydney on Saturday, Francis Cluny, he gave a lecture on comparative theology. I guess what I mean is that the Muslims haven't really engaged with the texts, the Torah, at a scholarly level to do that kind of comparison. I've done it with the story of Joseph, and because that's the only story in the Quran that's given full. And that story also exists in the Bible.
Yes,
it's remarkably similar. The only differences are there is emphasis in the Quran a bit more on Joseph preaching, as opposed to where in the Bible it's more of a story, historical account, whereas in the Quran he's always engaging with people in preaching that monotheism. Those parts are highlighted more, or there's more detail there. In the biblical story, in the middle of the story, there's a break, and it just goes on to another story, totally irrelevant to Joseph, and then comes back to Joseph.
Yes,
I guess it gives a patchy look. I guess that's where a Muslim scholar would say, where did this one come from? Why is there a break in that story?
Right.
And it just goes somewhere else. It looks like it's been edited.
Right. But the Quran itself is non-linear, isn't it? Like, it's not a linear book. It's you can read the surahs not in any sort of order, but still gain understanding. In fact, they often, in the version I read, it says read the shorter surahs to begin with, and then...
That's right. The shortest chapter in the Quran is one line, and all Muslims start memorizing that.
Yes.
And interestingly, that's about monotheism.
Right.
Now, the stories in the Quran are also like prophetic stories. Sometimes it's covered in a single verse, the entire story. Sometimes it's spread. It highlights certain bits. But in terms of the text itself, in its Arabic form, there is coherence. Like there's no... you need to know Arabic to appreciate this. Like every chapter in the Quran has its own sound.
Yes.
When you read the English translation, it all looks the same. And sometimes even certain things, what's it talking about here?
Yes.
But when you read the Arabic, linguistically, those parts where you may think, what's it talking about? Linguistically, they're the most eloquent. So there's that emotive power of the Quran, and the chapters have a continuity of that sound and rhythm, where you don't see a break in that sound. But obviously, in the contents, there is one would argue that a deliberate break, depending on what topic it's covering, it's highlighting certain part of the story.
I suppose, well, we should have explained what shirk is to people who don't understand, but I think there are specific ideas in relation to Christianity that are incommensurate with the ideas of the monotheism of Islam. And I wonder if you could talk about those.
Yeah, shirk means associating partnership with God, or if a person worships anyone other than God, that's committing shirk. If divinity of God is split into entities, it's considered shirk.
Like the Trinity.
Like the Trinity, yeah. The Quran is critical of Trinity. The Quran is critical of Muslims too, by the way.
Right.
Like, especially there's a charge of hypocrisy to Muslim. Obviously, hypocrisy is if you say you believe but you don't necessarily believe in your heart.
Yes.
Like the second chapter, first chapter in the Quran, 7 verses, and then the longest chapter comes, and immediately starts by defining belief, disbelief, and hypocrisy. And belief, disbelief is covered in 2-3 verses each, but hypocrisy is covered in 13 verses.
Right.
So that's the that's criticism to Muslims, or those people who claim to be a Muslim. In chapter 49, verse 14, it says, "Oh, you Arabs, desert Arabs, you say you believe, but faith hasn't entered your heart."
Yes.
So Quran is also critical of what it considers to be wrong interpretations or wrong beliefs with respect to Christianity and Judaism as well.
Yes.
But it never does that in an absolute sense, and it never does it. It never focuses on the people. It focuses on the ideas, beliefs in its criticism, and even like when it does this in chapter 3, for instance.
Yes.
At the end of that passage in verse 115 to 113 to 115, it says, "Not all Jews and Christians are the same.
No.
And amongst them you will have those who celebrate the glory of God at night and do good. They will not be wronged." And that's an important exception that Quran holds.
Yeah, I suppose in I don't know which. I think it might have been the cow,
but I guess the important thing is the correct belief. Quran's focus is that there is only one God, and that there's evidence for that in the natural world. There's evidence for it in the scriptures, revelation, that one should stick to that, and anything other than that, it considers false belief.
One of the surahs that I read was around Jews, Christians and Sabians, an early sect around the time of Muhammad, will be saved. One of the points it was making was around the divisiveness of religion, Jews against Christians, and sort of introducing Islam to come in as overarching, essentially saying, well, Islam is the correct faith, but if you essentially believe in the God of Abraham, then you're looking forward to paradise. But then later on it contradicts itself. It says only Muslims can be saved, essentially.
Well, it depends how you understand what.
Well, the point I would make is that probably some of the beliefs, like Trinity belief, is not necessarily pretty fundamental to being Christian, because lots of Christians would believe different things, particularly Christians in the early part of the church before the Roman Empire, and even now. But the idea of Jesus as Messiah, which Muslims talk about, but the idea that Jesus wasn't crucified, that would be quite difficult for most Christians to accept. And that would sort of negate, if they had that belief, that would sort of negate them anyway, you would think, from true belief, if Islam was the true belief in that respect. Do you see my logic, my point there?
Yeah, I see your point. As you said, I'm not a Christian theologian, But I know some of the biblical history, and until 325 Nicene Council, there were competing theologies about Jesus.
Yes.
Which means about crucifixion, and which also means about nature of God.
Yes.
And these were debated, and in the end, Trinitarian theology won, and that became dominant, and any alternatives were persecuted by the Roman Empire. And I'm not saying this as a criticism, that's a fact of history. So, like Roman Catholicism won the battle, or Christianity became Roman Catholicism, and then there's a breakaway with the Protestant reform. So Muslims or Islam came in 7th century, and it was responding to theologies in its time. And it's the only religion that talks about Christianity.
Yes.
If you think about it. And it's the only religion that accepts Jesus.
Yes.
And actually, when Jesus, the Quran talks about him as from the Spirit of God, like Ruhullah, Kalimullah, like these are Spirit of God or Word of God as used in the Quran. Like this, Jesus is special in his immaculate conception, which Quran acknowledges, by the way. And the only thing that Quran falls short is calling him divine. Jesus having a divine nature, and that is definitely from an Islamic theological perspective tantamount to shirk. I mean, that's the view of Islam, whether one would agree or not. I know how central that is to Christianity. Also, crucifixion. There were Christians in the early centuries who also believed Jesus was not crucified, and I also understand why that's so central. The resurrection. It's not, and but I have actually, if we really think about, or the way a Muslim mind, scholarly mind works is like this. I look at the Quran as a text, and say, what does Quran telling me objectively, without me reading into it my interpretation.
Modern interpretation as well.
Modern or classic, like. You could be so influenced and biased by your view that sometimes you want to see what you want to believe in the text.
Yes.
That is a very dangerous path. Right. The text should be engaged in its own right first.
You're a modern person with modern thoughts. You grew up in Turkey? You were born in Turkey?
As a child, yeah, I was born in Turkey.
It seems to me like a interpretation of an ancient text. It would be almost impossible not to bring some of yourself into that.
Yeah, look, of course. However, the initial engagement has to be within the book itself.
The boundaries of the
text.
Right.
Because you just want to remove as much bias as possible. To understand the text in its own right. But then there is the context, right, which it's part of Islamic scholarship.
Right.
For example, there's an aspect of Quranic exegesis or interpretation, which is called reasons for revelation. Like you look at why was this text, part of the text was revealed, or in response to what event, what question. And if you know that, then we would understand the historical context. That would be the second thing to do. And the third aspect would be to look at our context in the time in which we live in and see what kind of inspirations we could get from the Quran and also what kind of readings we can go into it. But I'll give you one example of interfaith dialogue, for example.
Sure.
Right? Interfaith dialogue is a modern phenomenon. It's in the last 20, 30 years. When some of the verses in the Quran that have interfaith dialogue nature were bypassed by previous scholars when they looked at him, because yes, they did understand those words, but it wasn't speaking to them in their time.
Right.
Or there was no need to engage a bit more closely with those verses.
Yes.
Whereas in our time, these verses jump at you when you read the Quran. Like, let's say, for example, "O people of the book, come to a common term between us." Like, that's a very significant verse
Yes.
in the Quran that for me as a Muslim theologian living in Australia and always engaging with non-Muslims, it's very important, that verse. Whereas
What is
the verses dealing with perhaps warfare become silent to me, because those verses are not applicable as applicable in Australia as it was perhaps in the old times. So,
but it would depend on time and context, wouldn't it? Because, I mean, as a Muslim, so the verses that say that you're sort of morally obligated to take up arms if you're under threat, unless you're gravely ill, unless you've got a grave disability or something like that. If you were living in, say, the Ottoman Empire during a caliphate and you're under threat, as your country is under threat, your empire,
or you're invaded, or you're under threat, yes, certainly. Like,
you would be obligated to take up military service.
No, you have the option.
But wouldn't the verse be saying to you, if you're physically well, then the people who decide to stay home don't? Well, that's true. They don't.
Verses, there's no obligation in verses.
Right.
It's more encouragement.
Right.
Because even at the time of the Prophet, people chose to take part. Like Prophet Muhammad never had a standing army. He never had a state bureaucracy.
But it had some stigma attached to it. If you chose to stay home and not go out into military service, you weren't as highly valued as the person. It talks about the value of the person who decides to do that, who gives up the good of themselves and their property to go out and...
But it's more, a lot of reward is promised with that. You know, it's encouragement rather than shame. I mean, women in England shamed men for returning, even when they're wounded, and they shamed them on street.
It's been
why are you staying here when others are fighting? You know.
Yes.
I mean, if you're in threat, and if you're able, physically to go and as a man, you would be expected. Yes, certainly, and Quran does that, and there is a shame to that, and if you don't, and there's honor if you do, and these are subjective though, and it really depends on the cases in which you live in. Now, I guess if we kind of look at it from a legal, or let's say Afghanistan was invaded, right? Now, people of Afghanistan has the right to defend themselves militarily if they are invaded militarily.
Yes.
Whether that's the wise thing to do is a different matter, but standing from Australia, for example, when you look at, you say, coalition forces, they're there for temporarily, they're not gonna, they just went there to get rid of Al-Qaeda, catch Osama bin Laden. We can look at it that way, and we can understand why it's temporary, and that why you may even feel justified. Whereas the people in Afghanistan don't know that. All they're seeing is these army soldiers coming in and fighting the people, knocking down houses, bombing places. So some amongst them will think this is bad for them.
Yes.
And then they may decide to take up arms.
Yes.
Now, I'm not here advocating, obviously, violence or terrorism, but I'm just trying to explain that
looking at the
any piece of land that's been invaded, people of that land has the right to defend it.
But in the case of Afghanistan, I think the UN stats from 2011 till 2013 were that 94% of I think it's somewhere between 94 and 97% of the casualties that were produced were Taliban casualties. And then they refused aid from the UN for food and supplies to 160,000 people. So this was, often we look at this and forget that it's these sort of political, religious military movements within a country like that that are doing tremendous amounts of damage to their own citizens.
Look, I agree. It's good that Taliban went away. I'm not disagreeing with that.
They're back.
But again, it shows the futility of military intervention.
Yes.
And in my view, if I would probably say just collaborate, let them leave as soon as possible.
Yes.
That might be a wiser thing to do if you're invaded.
Yes.
But standing here, though, is invasion a good thing? I tell you, when Iraq was invaded, and then you had the Arab Spring 2011,
yes.
Syria was in turmoil for about 6 months, and then there was lack of intervention. There was a window of opportunity to intervene if there was a very strong diplomatic push by United States
yes.
and the Western powers. Probably the civil war could have been prevented.
Right.
But when it couldn't, and then you had ISIS in 2014, I actually predicted to my friends, I said, in 5 years there will not be ISIS at all. It will collapse. And it wasn't a wild guess. It was exactly the same conditions that was in Afghanistan, which produced it. Afghanistan was invaded, there was civil war, and that creates a huge gap.
Yes.
And then Taliban came in, became a dominant force, and they collapsed in 5 years.
Well, they overthrew the Northern Alliance, didn't they? And then
they took over the whole country, but then they're so grotesque, the kind of government they do, inevitably something was going to happen, and that's when 9/11 happens in the United States, comes and collapses Taliban. And I predicted with the ISIS that it will go away in 5 years. It's got a 5-year shelf life.
Right. And
2019, this year, ISIS no more as a political entity. It will be Al Qaeda 2.0, but it will live on as a kind of a insurgent thing, terrorist organization, but it's gone as a political entity. That's what I mean by the 5-year term. It was more as a government and politics.
Right. Because you were critical of the US withdrawal, or the plans that they announced for withdrawal from Syria. I read an article about that in the conversation.
No, I'm not critical. I'm just analysing who's doing what for what motives,
right.
and what consequences that would produce. That's how I approach the Syrian.
What are the motives and the consequences?
Okay, we're now moving on to Syria.
We'll move on to Syria. Is that you happy to do that?
I guess I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk more other things about Islam, if you have other aspects.
It is interesting because we will link it back. There are things about ISIS that I'll link back to questions about, interestingly enough, questions about Islamic philosophy and theology.
How do you link that to ISIS?
Do you want to go straight into that?
Yeah, let's go straight into it, because the other politics is complex and it will take a while to...
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things I was really interested in is ISIS captured the town of Dabiq. Dabiq. And their glossy English magazine was Dabiq as well, which is one of their recruiting tools. And one of the reasons that it was so integral to them was that they saw it as a kind of place of Islamic Armageddon where they would finally face off with the Christian Crusaders. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, how that figures into Islamic scholarship and the history and philosophy of it.
Mm. Look, ISIS
was that reasonable?
Look, let me tell you this. Al-Qaeda, we know Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization. We know them as extremists, right?
Yes.
Al-Qaeda declared ISIS as extremists. I mean, that tells you the level of extremism of ISIS.
Well, they're all sort of mutually antagonistic, aren't they? I mean, I'd read something talking about
They became competitors.
Yeah,
basically.
Boko Haram, the Taliban, ISIS. That ISIS may be in competition with the remnants of the Taliban to take over Afghanistan. Yeah. They're antagonistic.
Yeah. Sure. Look, I actually examined the Dabiq magazine and its contents and its language, and did a conference presentation on that. I actually was looking at the theological justifications of their actions. They always justify what they do with Islam, or sometimes quoting verses or sayings of the Prophet or some sort of a religious ruling in the past. But it's always there's some utility in what they pick and choose. Let's say, for example, they capture a town, and they get 2,000 Shiite young people. What are they going to do with them? If you really follow proper Islamic law, they should be looked after well. They should be fed well. I mean, you imprison them, but treat them humanely and so on. But what they do is they go and execute everybody. And the reason for that, and then they give a justification of it. But it's really the utility, because it's better in their eyes to just get rid of these people than look after them, because looking after is expensive, it takes resources. What if they escape? So it's the utility. And another example is Yazidi women. They're selling Yazidi women to slavery. They have these volunteers from across the world, young people. They're blooded boiling. They've got sexual needs. You can't get married easily. How are you going to meet their needs? Okay, so it's so convenient to enslave these Yazidi women and then sell them amongst the warriors. So it's the utility, unfortunately, of. So they pick and choose these references, either interpreted themselves or they take a fringe interpretation. They take it as the normative ruling, and then they apply it to the situation they're in, which produces a very grotesque, unfortunately, expression of Islam and Muslims.
I think there's probably heterogeneity even within that. I remember reading about the Taliban selling women into sex slavery from villages that they'd conquered into Pakistan. But not all of the Taliban were on board with that. So some of the Taliban captains actually broke off and moved away because they believed that was wrong. They received a huge amount of international criticism because their rationale for their strict codes of dress and the behaviour and the escorts of women was around women's protection, but then they were doing the selling women to sex slavery. But you see that there are different values, and there must be various different iterations even within one group.
ISIS is not seen as a legitimate theological view. They don't even follow proper theological school.
That's why they say so-called caliphate, don't they?
The caliphate is a political position.
Right.
It's an executive role. Caliphate the last caliph was the Ottoman Caliph, which was abolished in 1924.
But that was essentially, in terms of Islamic scholars, that would be an official caliphate, and the caliphate launched by ISIS would not be considered an official caliphate.
That's what Muslim scholars, or legitimate, I would say. Because the Ottoman one was legitimate, was well accepted by Muslims around the world, whereas the ISIS one is self-declared.
Yes.
And there's no. For caliphate or the leadership, to be legitimate, it needs popular support. And in Islam, is in Islamic political theory, that you must get popular support.
Yes.
Whoever the leader, however they're elected. But definitely ISIS never had that support. And if you put it to vote, I don't know what they would get, 0.001%.
Right.
Or Muslims would probably support them. But they wanted that. The ISIS saw an opportunity there to grab hold territory which was just free to take, and then declare a state, and because they claim to be Islamic, and it can only be a caliphate.
Yes.
And that's appealing, in a way, that's appealing to Muslims, because even today, there's a lot of Muslims think that Muslim world, even though they are a very large population, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, they suffer in the geopolitical game because there's no balance of power. And that if caliphate was established, if there was a single person who represented all Muslims, it would give that person a lot of clout in international diplomacy, and hopefully that should be in the favor of Muslims.
Yes.
Or Muslims at least should be equal in the table of diplomacy.
It's the
and
return
it seems
to modernity, essentially. It's the development of the modernity that we talked about.
Yeah. So some Muslims see that as a solution to establish a caliphate. So it does have a ideological support to some extent, but when even those Muslims who support the idea of a caliphate
Yes.
would not necessarily support ISIS, because their idea of leadership in the Muslim world is more modern and perhaps more proper and something that international community could deal with. Sit down and have a talk.
Right.
I guess this is a very important element of that Muslims have to think about. Like, in my view, the challenge for Muslims from politics is kind of develop a governance model that is Islamic, but also at the same time it can be seen as fresh and acceptable to international community. I'm not saying that is the criteria, but
yes.
I guess the measure of something being good is if non-Muslims can see the goodness in it.
Yes.
and can actually find it acceptable, even if they disagree. We definitely saw that with early Muslims. Like when
Right.
early Muslims went spread across the Middle East and then North Africa, even Central Asia, in India and so on.
Yes.
When they went, they actually provided a fresh political rule, which was freedom was very important. They provided less tax, more freedom for individuals, and they find it more tolerant.
This is more like liberalism, essentially.
It was more liberal for its time.
Yes,
I guess if you bring all of that to today, probably it would fall short a little bit.
Yes.
But nevertheless, people sometimes invited Muslims in because they saw them as liberators. And when Spanish Inquisition was happening in 16th century, 500,000 Jews were kicked out. Muslims were kicked out of Spain. Spain was 70% Muslim at some stage. And these people largely went to Muslim countries. Even the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid received asylum seekers.
Yes.
They were properly recorded, and there was a settlement process. They settled them in different cities, towns, so that they were equally distributed, and so they were looked after well. They were received well.
Yes.
And then even Sultan Bayezid sends a letter to King Ferdinand and says, "Thank you for sending the best of your people over.
Right.
We needed them."
Right.